A metallic click echoed across the coral ridgeline. Private First Class Thomas Brennan locked the M7 launcher onto his rifle's muzzle. 200 yards ahead, a concrete pillbox sat silent and deadly. 3 Marines already lay motionless in the volcanic sand. Brennan slid a fragmentation grenade onto the steel tube, chambered the grenade blank, and felt the weight shift in his hands. What happened next would redefine how infantry cleared fortified positions. What the Japanese defenders inside that bunker saw coming through their firing slit would become the stuff of their worst nightmares. September 1944. The island of Peleliu burned under a sun that turned metal too hot to touch and drove men to madness. The 1st Marine Division had been ashore for 3 days, and they were dying in ways that training could never prepare them for. Not from bonsai charges or mortar fire. They were dying because the enemy had learned. The Japanese had abandoned their doctrine of defending beaches at all costs. They had stopped throwing men into suicidal frontal attacks. Instead, they had gone underground. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa commanded the 14th Infantry Division, defending Peleliu, and he had studied every American amphibious landing since Tarawa. He understood that shore defenses, no matter how well built, would be obliterated by naval gunfire. He understood that massed infantry charges were suicide against American firepower. So he did something different. He built a fortress that breathed with the island itself. 500 caves, 11 miles of tunnels, reinforced concrete bunkers positioned to create interlocking fields of fire, firing ports carved at ground level so narrow that grenades bounced off the stone beside them, machine gun nests set back 30 feet inside cave mouths where direct fire couldn't reach, artillery pieces mounted on rails that could be rolled into firing position, shoot, and disappear back into the mountain before counter-battery fire arrived. The Umurbrogol ridges became a killing ground designed by an engineer's nightmare and a tactician's cold genius. And the Marines were stuck. Standard infantry tactics weren't working. You couldn't charge a bunker when the approaches were covered by 3 more positions you couldn't see. Hand grenades rarely made it through the narrow firing slits. And when they did, the defenders simply moved deeper into their tunnels until the explosion passed. Flamethrowers could reach inside, but getting close enough to use one meant crossing open ground under murderous fire. Tank rounds punched holes in coral, but did nothing to bunkers buried 15 feet underground. Satchel charges worked if you could get close enough to place them, but that meant crawling through machine gun fire with 40 pounds of explosives strapped to your back. Men were dying to gain yards. Brennan had watched his squad leader take a bullet to the throat, trying to get close enough to throw a grenade. He'd seen a flamethrower operator take 3 steps into the open before Japanese rifle fire punctured his tanks and turned him into a human torch. He'd heard the screams of men trapped in the open with no cover, no concealment, and no way forward or back. The island was devouring them. Then came the order that changed everything. Every rifle squad was to have at least 1 man equipped with the M7 grenade launcher and trained in its use. The M7 launcher looked deceptively simple. A tubular steel attachment that clamped onto the muzzle of the M1 Garand, secured by the rifle's bayonet lug. The rear end enclosed the barrel. The front end opened into a wider tube that held the grenade's tail fin assembly. Total weight, about 1 pound. Installation time, 15 seconds. It transformed the finest battle rifle of the war into something else entirely. An infantry mortar, a bunker buster, a weapon that could deliver high explosives with rifle precision at ranges hand grenades could never achieve. The ammunition came in wooden crates marked with yellow stencils. M9A1 anti-tank grenades with shaped charges that could punch through 3 inches of armor plate. M17 fragmentation grenades based on the MK2 hand grenade, but fitted with impact fuses and stabilizing fins. Each one weighed just over a pound. Each one could be fired to effective ranges of 150 to 200 yards. And each one was launched by a special grenade blank cartridge that delivered just enough gas pressure to hurl the projectile without destroying the rifle. The training was brutal and brief. Lock the launcher. Load the grenade tail first into the tube. Insert the grenade blank into the chamber. Brace the rifle, but against the ground at a 45-degree angle. Aim using the specialized quadrant sight attached to the rear sight assembly. pull the trigger. The rifle would slam back against the ground with enough force to crack, would, if you didn't hold it properly. The grenade would arc through the air, fins stabilizing its flight, and detonate on impact. Brennan practiced on coral outcroppings until his shoulder ached and his ears rang despite the cotton stuffed in them. He learned to judge distance by eye, to account for wind, to compensate for the slight wobble every grenade had as it left the tube. He learned that the weapon's real advantage wasn't just range. It was precision. A trained grenadier could place a round through a firing slit the size of a shoebox at 100 yards. He could drop explosives into trench lines behind berms, into cave mouths that hand grenades couldn't reach. And when the word spread through the Japanese positions about what was happening, when defenders realized that the Americans had found a way to put explosives exactly where they wanted them without exposing themselves to fire, something shifted in the psychological calculus of the battle. The Marines began calling rifle grenadiers up to every position where the advance had stalled. The pattern repeated across Peleliu's ridgelines, across Saipan's cane fields, across every contested inch of coral and volcanic rock where Japanese defenders had dug in deep. It started with reconnaissance. Marines would identify the firing slits, the cave mouths, the camouflage positions that were holding up the advance. Then they'd call for the grenadier. Brennan would move up through whatever cover existed, sometimes crawling, sometimes sprinting between shell craters. He'd find a position with a clear line of sight, usually 40 to 60 yards closer than riflemen could get without being cut down. He'd set up the rifle, estimate the range, adjust the sight, and fire. The first grenade was often a ranging shot. It would impact near the target, shower in position with fragmentation, and letting the grenadier correct his aim. The second grenade went where it needed to go. When an M17 fragmentation grenade detonated inside a confined space like a bunker or cave entrance, the effects were catastrophic. The explosive core fragmented the grenade's cast iron body into hundreds of irregular metal shards moving at supersonic velocity. In an open area, the lethal radius was about 15 yards. Inside a bunker, with walls to reflect and focus the blast, that radius meant everyone inside was in the kill zone. The concussion alone could rupture eardrums, collapse lungs, cause traumatic brain injury even if the fragmentation didn't tear through flesh and bone. Survivors of bunkers hit by rifle grenades described the effects in ways that stayed with interrogators long after the war. The sound arrived first, a crack boom that wasn't like artillery or mortars. It was sharper, closer, too fast to take cover from. Then the pressure wave, slamming against chests and faces like an invisible wall. Then the fragmentation, ricocheting off concrete walls in patterns impossible to predict or avoid. Men died from wounds that didn't bleed externally because the shrapnel had tumbled through organs and lodged against spines. Others survived physically but couldn't hear for days, couldn't speak without stuttering, couldn't sleep without seeing the flash again and again. The psychological impact grew with every position that fell to grenade fire. Japanese doctrine emphasized holding defensive positions to the last man. Nakagawa's orders were clear. No retreat, no surrender. Die at your post. But doctrine assumed that defenders would see their enemy. They would fire until ammunition ran out or the enemy closed the bayonet range. They would sell their lives in direct combat. Rifle grenades changed that equation. Defenders found themselves under attack from enemies they couldn't see, at ranges their weapons couldn't effectively return fire against. A grenadier firing from 150 yards away was just another Marine in the tree line. There was no way to distinguish him from riflemen until the grenade was already in flight. By then, it was too late to do anything but pray the round missed or that the bunker's overhead cover would hold. It didn't hold often. Brennan's most effective engagement came on the 8th day of the Peleliu operation. His platoon had been stalled for 6 hours trying to take a ridge position the maps designated as Hill 120. 3 bunkers covered the only approach, positioned in a triangle that gave each one overlapping fields of fire with the others. Frontal assault had failed twice. A flanking attempt had been stopped by machine gun fire from positions the Marines hadn't even known were there. The company commander was talking about pulling back and calling for an airstrike when Brennan studied the position through binoculars and saw something. The bunkers weren't buried as deep as the ones lower on the ridge. Overhead cover looked like logs and coral rubble rather than reinforced concrete, and the firing slits were larger, probably giving machine gunners better fields of fire against expected assault. Brennan positioned himself in a shell crater 80 yards from the nearest bunker. The angle was perfect. He could see all three positions. He loaded an M9A1 anti-tank grenade, the shaped charge variant, and aimed at the center bunker's firing slit. The first round went high, impacting the hillside above the position. He adjusted and fired again. The second grenade disappeared into the firing slit, as if it had been aimed by divine intervention. The shaped charge detonated with a focused jet of superheated gas and molten metal that punched through the bunker's rear wall and ignited ammunition stored inside. The explosion that followed wasn't just a grenade. It was every machine gun belt, every rifle round, every grenade the defenders had stockpiled. The bunker's roof lifted, hung in the air for a moment that seemed frozen in time, then collapsed inward. Brennan shifted fire to the left bunker before the survivors could react. 2 grenades. One struck the firing slit's edge and showered the interior with fragmentation. The second went clean through and detonated inside. The machine gun went silent. The third bunker's crew abandoned their position and tried to retreat deeper into the ridge complex. Marine riflemen cut them down as they ran. Hill 120 fell in 20 minutes. The cost was 3 rifle grenades and the bruise forming on Brennan's shoulder from the launcher's recoil. The alternative would have been another frontal assault, another dozen casualties, another 5 or 6 hours of fighting for a position that should never have been so hard to take. Word of engagements like this spread through both sides. Among Marines, rifle grenadiers went from being just another specialty to being the most requested asset whenever the advance hit resistance. Squads fought over who got the launcher. Men volunteered to carry the extra weight of grenades and blank cartridges. Company commanders started holding back grenadiers for critical missions rather than using them as standard riflemen. Among Japanese defenders, the weapon acquired a reputation that grew with every bunker that fell to it. Prisoners taken late in the campaign, men who had spent weeks underground listening to American fire chew through their positions, spoke of the rifle grenades with something approaching superstitious dread. They gave a nickname, though translations vary. Some sources report it as Dekuro Kadaki, Skullcracker. Others say Adamakawashi, Headbreaker. The exact words mattered less than the meaning. This was the weapon that found you where you thought you were safe. This was the weapon that killed you without giving you the chance to die in combat, as doctrine demanded. The nickname had basis in grim reality. The blast effects of grenades in confined spaces did catastrophic damage to heads even when fragmentation missed. Concussion caused by pressure waves in enclosed bunkers resulted in a specific pattern of injuries that field medics came to recognize. Bleeding from ears and nose. Unconsciousness without visible wounds. Men who seemed physically intact, but who never woke up because their brains had been slammed against the inside of their skulls with lethal force. Japanese medical personnel, what few there were on islands like Peleliu, noted these injuries in reports that were captured after the war. They attributed them specifically to American rifle grenades rather than hand grenades or artillery. The precision delivery meant grenades detonated exactly where they would do maximum damage. A hand grenade thrown into a bunker might land near the entrance and have its blast partially vented outside. A rifle grenade came through the firing slit and detonated in the center of the occupied space. There was no escape from that, but the weapon's success raised questions that made military planners uncomfortable. The rifle grenade turned the M1 Garand into a crew-served weapon in practice, if not in designation. A grenadier needed someone to spot targets, someone to guard his position while he was focused on aiming, someone to carry extra ammunition. The launcher's recoil made it impractical to fire from the shoulder, which meant the grenadier wasn't a rifleman while he had the launcher attached. In protracted firefights, this limitation mattered. The specialized ammunition was another problem. Grenade blanks looked similar to standard ball ammunition, but had radically different pressure curves. Mixing them up could destroy a rifle and injure the shooter. There were documented cases of Marines loading standard ammunition with the launcher attached and suffering catastrophic failures when they fired. The barrel pressure from a full-power cartridge with a grenade blocking the muzzle was enough to split the barrel or blow the receiver apart. Training emphasized the difference, but in the chaos of combat, mistakes happened. Range was both advantage and limitation. A rifle grenade could reach 200 yards, but accuracy dropped significantly beyond 150. Wind, the grenade's trajectory, the improvised nature of the sighting system, all of these factors meant that long-range shots were as much prayer as precision, compared to mortars that could drop round from overhead or artillery that could pound positions from miles away. The rifle grenade was a close-range weapon that required direct line of sight. It filled a gap in infantry firepower, but it didn't replace existing systems. Engineers questioned whether the benefits justified the trade-offs. The M1 Garand had been designed as a semi-automatic rifle, perhaps the most effective infantry weapon of the war. Turning it into a grenade launcher meant taking out of action as a rifle. Some ordnance officers argued that dedicated grenade launchers or light mortars would be more effective. Give infantry squads a weapon designed for the task rather than an adapter that compromised a rifle. But combat experience told a different story. Marines and soldiers didn't want dedicated launchers. They wanted their rifles to do more. The M7 launcher could be removed in seconds when it wasn't needed. It added minimal weight. It used the same rifle every man was already trained on and trusted with his life. There was no learning curve for a completely new weapon system, no separate supply chain, no additional qualification courses. You took your Garand, added the launcher, and suddenly you had a precision delivery system for explosives. The tactical flexibility mattered in ways quartermasters couldn't quantify. When a squad hit unexpected resistance, they didn't need to call for mortar support that might take minutes or hours to arrive. They had their own indirect fire capability right there. When a sniper's position needed to be suppressed immediately, a rifle grenade could do it faster than coordinating with supporting arms. When a cave needed to be cleared and the flamethrower operator was down, the grenadier could put fragmentation rounds inside until nothing moved. This capability proved itself across every island where Marines faced entrenched Japanese positions. At Iwo Jima, where 21,000 offenders had built a defensive network even more sophisticated than Peleliu, rifle grenades were used to reduce bunkers in terrain where tanks couldn't maneuver and where artillery fire was ineffective against positions carved into volcanic rock. At Okinawa, where the Japanese had months to prepare defenses and where they committed their largest ground forces of the Pacific Campaign, rifle grenadiers became integral to every assault team tasked with clearing fortified positions. The statistics, fragmentary as they are, suggest the weapon's impact. After-action reports from Peleliu indicate rifle grenades were used to reduce at least 180 defensive positions during the 2-month campaign. Unit histories from Iwo Jima credit rifle grenades with enabling advances in sectors where progress had stalled for days. Marine Corps training doctrine was revised after these campaigns to emphasize rifle grenade employment, and the number of grenadiers per squad was increased. But for the men who carried the launcher, the weapon's value wasn't measured in statistics. It was measured in the Marines, who didn't die because a bunker fell without requiring a frontal assault. It was measured in the ground taken and held because defenders couldn't survive in positions they thought were impregnable. It was measured in the knowledge that when your squad hit a pillbox or a cave or a concealed machine gun nest, you had a tool that could solve the problem without waiting for higher echelons to save you. Brennan survived Peleliu. He survived the 73 days of fighting on an island that was supposed to fall in 4. He came home with a Purple Heart for shrapnel wounds to his leg, a Bronze Star for actions that remained classified for decades, and hearing damage that never fully healed. In interviews conducted years after the war, he spoke about the rifle grenades with a kind of practical appreciation that comes from tools that keep you alive. We didn't think about whether it was elegant or whether engineers liked it. He said in an oral history recorded in 1987, "We thought about whether it worked. And it worked. It put grenades where we needed them when we needed them. That's what mattered. That's what kept us moving forward when every other option got men killed." The Japanese perspective, where it exists, confirms the weapon's psychological and tactical impact. Post-war interrogations of officers who survived island campaigns consistently mention American rifle grenades as one of the most feared weapons they faced. Not because it was more deadly than artillery or flamethrowers in absolute terms. but because it represented the American ability to bring overwhelming firepower to bear at every level of combat. Japanese doctrine had been built around the assumption that entrenched offenders could inflict catastrophic casualties on any assault force. The defensive positions on Peleliu and Iwo Jima were designed to make every yard cost American lives until the invasion became too expensive to continue. The rifle grenade disrupted that calculus. It gave American infantry a tool to crack fortifications without the casualties that frontal assaults demanded. It shortened the kill radius between defender and attacker in ways that Japanese planners hadn't anticipated. In the broader context of Pacific War tactics, the rifle grenade represented American military culture's emphasis on firepower and technology as solutions to tactical problems. Where other armies might have accepted higher casualties as a cost of taking defended positions, American commanders looked for weapons and methods that preserved infantry strength while maintaining offensive momentum. The rifle grenade was one piece of that puzzle, along with tank infantry coordination, naval gunfire support, close air support, and flamethrowers. The weapon didn't win the war. No single weapon system ever does. But it solved a specific, deadly problem that was killing Marines on every island where the Japanese had time to dig in. It gave squad leaders a tool that worked when the situation was desperate, and when higher support couldn't reach them in time. It filled the gap between what a rifleman could do with his weapon and what a mortar team or tank could do with theirs. The post-war development of dedicated grenade launchers like the M79 and later the M203 underslung launcher suggests that military planners recognize the value of giving infantry organic grenade launching capability. But those weapons came later, developed with the benefit of lessons learned in the Pacific and Korea. In 1944 and 1945, when Marines were dying on volcanic rock and coral sand, the M7 launcher and the M1 Garand were what they had, and they were enough. The Skullcracker nickname persisted in Japanese military histories of the Pacific War. It became part of the larger narrative of American material superiority, of enemies who seemed to have a technological answer for every tactical problem. For Japanese soldiers who had been told they could hold off any assault through discipline and willingness to die, the rifle grenade was proof that willingness wasn't enough when the enemy could kill you from outside your effective range with weapons that turned your fortifications into tombs. There's a photograph from Peleliu, taken in October 1944, that captures something essential about the weapon and the men who used it. A Marine sits in a shell crater, rifle propped against a coral, with an M7 launcher attached. His face is gaunt, age beyond his 22 years. His hands are steady on the rifle. Behind him, smoke rises from a bunker that no longer holds living defenders. The photo doesn't show the grenades he fired or the position he reduced. It shows a man with a tool that worked, in a place where nothing else had. The lesson isn't about the superiority of American weapons or the inevitability of the Pacific Campaign's outcome. The lesson is about adaptation under pressure. When standard tactics failed and men were dying to gain yards, Marines found a way to put explosives exactly where they needed them without requiring suicidal charges or calling for support that might not arrive in time. They turned their rifles into grenade launchers because that's what the situation demanded, and that's what the weapon could do. Engineers could question the trade-offs. Ordnance officers could design better systems. Planners could optimize supply chains and doctrine. But the Marines fighting for their lives on Peleliu's ridges didn't have time for optimization. They had the M1 Garand, the M7 launcher, and a crate of grenades. They made it work. And in doing so, they changed how infantry cleared fortified positions for the rest of the war. The rifle grenade story is ultimately about how wars are fought and won. Not through grand strategies or technological breakthroughs alone, but through the incremental advantages that keep soldiers alive and moving forward. A weapon that extends effective range by 100 yards. A tactic that reduces casualties by half. A tool that solves a problem right in front of you when every other solution takes too long or costs too much. That's what the Skullcracker was. Not a wonder weapon or a war winner. Just a steel tube that turned a rifle into something more when Marines needed it to be more in the volcanic hell of the Pacific. That was enough. The evolution of the rifle grenade attachment didn't end with World War II. The lessons learned in the Pacific directly influenced post-war infantry weapons development across multiple nations. The concept of giving individual soldiers or small teams the ability to deliver explosive payloads with precision at medium ranges became a fundamental requirement in weapons design. In Korea, the M7 launcher saw renewed service when American forces encountered similar tactical challenges. North Korean and Chinese forces used reverse-slope defensive positions, bunkers built into hillsides, and tunnels that echoed the Japanese defensive tactics of the Pacific. Once again, rifle grenades proved valuable in reducing fortified positions when mortars couldn't get proper angles, and when artillery was conserving ammunition during supply shortages. Veterans who had used rifle grenades in the Pacific found themselves training a new generation of Marines and soldiers in Korea. The institutional knowledge transferred across conflicts. Young riflemen learned from sergeants who had fought on Peleliu and Iwo Jima, men who could teach not just the mechanics of loading and firing, but the tactical judgment required to employ the weapon effectively. "The manual tells you how to aim," said one training sergeant at Camp Pendleton in 1951. "It doesn't tell you which bunker to hit first, or when to shift fire, or how to coordinate with your riflemen, so they can move while you're reloading." That comes from experience. That comes from doing it when people are shooting back. The Korean War also exposed some of the rifle grenades' limitations in different terrain and conditions. In the mountainous Korean landscape, with engagement ranges often extending to 300 or 400 yards, the rifle grenade's effective range became a more significant constraint. Mortars and recoilless rifles, weapons that could reach farther and hit harder, took on larger roles in supporting infantry assaults. But the rifle grenade maintained its place in the arsenal for close-in work, for sudden encounter battles where there wasn't time to call for supporting fires. Meanwhile, other nations took note of the American experience with rifle grenades. The Soviet Union developed their own rifle grenade systems for the SKS and later Kalashnikov rifles. The French, with experience from both world wars, continued developing rifle grenades and used them extensively in Indochina and Algeria. The British maintained rifle grenade capability through their transition from bolt-action to semi-automatic rifles. Each nation adapted the concept to their own doctrine and weapons, but the core idea remained constant: give infantry organic firepower that doesn't require supporting elements. The technical challenges of rifle grenade design continued to evolve. Engineers worked on improving accuracy through better fin stabilization. They developed grenades with different fuse types, point detonating, delay, and even bouncing charges that would pop up above a trench or bunker before detonating to maximize fragmentation coverage. The shape charge designs initially developed for anti-tank use were refined to be effective against bunkers and field works. But perhaps the most significant development was a recognition that rifle grenades, for all their utility, represented a transitional technology. The need they filled, medium-range explosive delivery by infantry, was real and wouldn't disappear. But the method of delivery could be optimized. This realization led directly to the development of dedicated grenade launchers like the American M79, which entered service in Vietnam. The M79 was purpose-built for launching grenades. It didn't compromise rifle capability because it wasn't a rifle. It had a rifle bore that spun the projectile for stability, eliminating the need for fins. It broke open for loading like a shotgun, making it faster to reload than attaching a grenade to a muzzle launcher. It could be fired from the shoulder, giving the grenadier mobility and the ability to engage targets without setting up, and it had an effective range of 350 meters, nearly double what the M7 launcher could reliably achieve. Vietnam veterans who had never used rifle grenades, who knew only the M79, might not have appreciated how much of that weapon's design philosophy came from Pacific. The M79 Grenadier's role in the squad, the specialist who could put explosive fire on target when riflemen couldn't reach, was identical to the rifle Grenadier's role on Peleliu. The tactics were the same. The purpose was the same. Only the hardware had evolved. The M203 grenade launcher, which attached on the barrel of the M16 rifle, represented another evolutionary step. It combined the dedicated grenade launcher concept with the recognition that grenadiers still needed to be riflemen. With an M203, a soldier carried a rifle that was a rifle first and a grenade launcher second, but both capabilities were always available without needing to attach or remove components. This was the ideal that the M7 launcher had approached but never quite achieved. Modern military forces have continued this evolution with weapons like the M320 and various smart grenade systems that can be programmed to airburst at specific ranges. But every one of these weapons, no matter how sophisticated, traces its conceptual lineage back to Marines on Pacific Islands who needed to put grenades into bunkers and had to improvise a way to do it with the weapons they already carried. The broader lesson of the rifle grenade development and use is about the relationship between doctrine, technology, and combat reality. Military doctrine in 1941 didn't emphasize rifle grenades because the style of warfare that made them valuable hadn't been encountered yet. American forces in the early Pacific Campaign were still learning how to conduct amphibious assaults against heavily fortified islands. The Japanese were still learning how to defend those islands most effectively. As both sides adapted, as Japanese defenses became more sophisticated and American assault techniques evolved to counter them, the need for weapons like the rifle grenade became apparent. The technology existed. Rifle grenades had been used in World War I and the interwar period, but it wasn't prioritized until combat experience demonstrated its value. Then it became critical. Then every squad wanted one. Then training and supply chains adapted to ensure grenadiers had what they needed. This process of combat adaptation, of recognizing problems and developing solutions under the pressure of actual warfare, characterized much of the Pacific Campaign's tactical evolution. The same pattern appears in the development of tank infantry coordination, in the refinement of amphibious assault techniques, in the employment of flamethrowers, in close air support procedures. Each represented the military's ability to observe what worked, what didn't, and adjust accordingly. The rifle grenade story is also about the individual soldier's agency in that adaptation process. It wasn't just staff officers and planners who recognized the weapon's value. It was men like Brennan, squad leaders, and fire team leaders who saw a tactical problem and realized they had a tool that could solve it. Their feedback drove the institutional changes that made rifle grenades standard equipment. Their experience informed the training that made later grenadiers effective. Their legacy influenced weapons development for decades. This bottom-up innovation, where solutions emerge from the soldiers facing the problems rather than being imposed from above, is a particular strength of military organizations that listen to their people. The Marine Corps and Army both had systems in place for after-action reports, for lessons learned, for veteran officers and NCOs to influence training and doctrine. The rifle grenade's rapid adoption and employment across the Pacific Campaign demonstrates those systems working as intended. There's also a question of ethical dimension that the weapon raises, though it was rarely discussed at the time. The rifle grenade made killing more efficient. It allowed American forces to reduce enemy positions with fewer casualties on their side. This is, in one sense, exactly what a military weapon should do. It protects your own forces while achieving tactical objectives. But the weapon also made death more impersonal. A grenadier firing from 150 yards couldn't see the faces of the men he was targeting. He saw a firing slit, a bunker entrance, a tactical problem to be solved with high explosives. The psychological distance between shooter and target was greater than with a rifle, far greater than with a bayonet or a hand grenade. Whether this is preferable or more troubling is a question without easy answers. Japanese defenders who surrendered after their positions were hit by rifle grenades spoke of the helplessness they felt. They could see rifle fire coming and shoot back. They could hear mortars and try to take cover. But rifle grenades came from nowhere, from enemies they couldn't locate, and there was nothing they could do except die or survive by chance. This psychological impact, the sense of being unable to fight back effectively, may have contributed to the weapon's reputation as a skullcracker as much as its physical effects. From the American perspective, the weapon reduced the moral weight of assault. It's one thing to order men to charge a machine gun, nest knowing many will die. It's another to tell a grenadier, put 3 rounds through a firing slit from behind cover. The cost in lives is radically different. The cost in conscience, perhaps, is as well. Whether this is progress or moral erosion depends on one's perspective on the nature of warfare itself. What isn't debatable is the weapon's effectiveness in the role it was designed for. The rifle grenade gave American infantry a capability they desperately needed when fighting an enemy that had mastered offensive warfare. It saved American lives. It accelerated the capture of strategic objectives. It demonstrated that technological solutions, even simple ones, could provide decisive advantages when employed correctly. The Skullcracker nickname, whether the translation is exact or approximate, captures something the Japanese defenders understood viscerally. This wasn't just another weapon. It was a psychological and tactical game changer that undermined the defensive doctrines they had built their strategy around. When you couldn't hold your position because the enemy could reach inside and kill you without exposing themselves to your fire, when the bunkers and caves that were supposed to protect you became tombs instead, when discipline and willingness to die weren't enough to stop the advance, that's when a weapon earns a reputation that outlasts the war. For Marines who carried the M7 launcher through Pacific, the weapon was never about psychology or tactics in the abstract. It was about surviving another day. It was about taking the next ridge without losing half your squad. It was about having an option when the situation turned desperate and every other tool had failed. The rifle grenade was simply the thing that worked when they needed something to work. And in the calculus of warfare, where success is measured in objectives taken and casualties sustained, that practical effectiveness matters more than any theoretical consideration. The rifle grenade wasn't elegant. It wasn't the weapon engineers would have designed if they'd started from scratch. But it was a weapon the infantry had, and they made it into something that changed how battles were fought and won. That, more than any technical specification or tactical manual, is why the rifle grenade matters in the history of infantry warfare. Not because it was revolutionary technology, but because it was available technology employed with desperate ingenuity by men who needed an edge and found it in a steel tube and a blank cartridge. The legacy of that weapon lives on in every modern grenade launcher, every infantry support weapon designed to give soldiers firepower they can carry and control themselves. The Skullcracker may have been forgotten by most, but its descendants remain essential tools in every military that learned the Pacific War's lessons. If you enjoyed this deep dive into forgotten weapons that shaped history, subscribe now. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Where in the world are you watching this from? Let us know in the comments below.